Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to our final stop in Malta, the Citadel of Gozo. This entire island is a mere 26 square miles and home to about 31,000 people who call themselves Gozitans. The two big ticket items here are the giant temples, the world's oldest freestanding buildings which date back to 5000 BCE, and the Citadel of Gozo, a fortified city that was a going concern all the way back in the Bronze Age. I had to miss the temples, but was able to visit the Citadel and the cities surrounding it. So get ready for some serious sightseeing and to learn about the potential pitfalls of relying on someone who claims to be a professional guide, with me, the Armchair Traveler. My name is Judy, and I love travel, history, and finding out what makes people tick. If you're enjoying my content, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your help means more people will see my content. If you want more information, I have a WordPress blog, a page on Facebook, and a Twitter handle. The addresses are here or in the information block at the bottom of the screen. Thank you and enjoy your visit. Islands rely on ports, and quite a few of them have become somewhat outmoded over time as ships have grown ever larger. The primary cruise port here on Gozo is called Mgar. It's only 3.5 miles from its partner on the main island. The name comes from the Arab word, which means port. The crossing from the main island only takes 25 minutes. There has been talk about building a bridge here, and it isn't really a very long distance. The channel that any bridge would follow is actually fairly deep, and the seabed is said to be uneven. Building a bridge here would require extensive underwater work and would be quite expensive, as would the alternative proposal for a tunnel. Gozo has a heliport, but no regular airport. So for most of us, if we're going to visit, we're going to be arriving by boat. Although I arrived on a cruise ship, not on a ferry boat. This is what's called a tender port. The harbor is too shallow and the docks are too small to accommodate most modern cruise ships, so they anchor some distance away. The passengers don't swim. They're ferried over to the island in lifeboats, sensibly renamed tenders so as not to frighten us landlubbers. Most people do fine on these tenders, but there are risks. One problem is that some people, fortunately not including your armchair traveler, do become seasick. The second is that there is a potential danger to passengers climbing onto and out of the tender, particularly if the boat is pitching up and down, which it was on the day that I visited. 2 crewmen were stationed at the hatch. Passengers had to climb up on a kind of step and then theoretically would be able to walk straight off and onto the dock. The crew carefully timed each exit. I think of myself as agile. My turn came, just as I was about to step out. The boat pitched up about 6 inches. The 2 crewmen grabbed my arms and kept me from pitching forward and smashing my face in, for which I am very grateful, but they yanked on my shoulder to do it. Better my shoulder than my front teeth, but my shoulder began to ache almost immediately and dogged me all day, and the next, and the day after. This last image shows you the view when you're being ferried over from the cruise ship. The Citadel is the collection of buildings on the left. The rather larger area on the right is the capital, Rabat, sometimes called Victoria, and the capital of the island. My paid tour of Medina was pretty much a bust, and I was quite unimpressed by the tour guide, who not only skipped over some of the stops without explaining why, but really didn't seem to know very much. Less than you'd get than reading, for example, a ChatGPT summary today about the history of the place. Imagine my dismay when I met up with the same tour guide when I arrived in Gozo. I resigned myself to following along and making the best of it. Again. Pointing my camera and taking photos which I'd have to identify later. While the guide was still awful, Rabat, which is sometimes called Victoria, and the Citadel actually helped me along. Unlike Medina and its surrounding suburb of Rabat, the Citadel here is part of the city. There was talk for centuries about demolishing it, but that never happened. I imagine some people thought it would fall down on its own, but that never happened either. What we see today is the successor of a much earlier Greek acropolis. It fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1551 and clearly needed a major upgrade. which it got under the Knights of St. John Hospitaller between 1599 and 1622. More work was done in the 17th century, and a great deal more starting in 2016, when the Citadel Rehabilitation Project began. It was an enormous undertaking, cost at least 14 million euros, or a bit more than about 15 million American dollars, and the investment shows. The designers created a visitor center, added restrooms, this is no small thing, and water fountains, restored the facades of the buildings inside, rehabilitated the ditch, built paths, squares, and streets inside and leading to the Citadel, and made much of the site accessible with chair lifts and lifting platforms. Among the many improvements was modern explanatory signage, shown here. Like Medina, habitation here dates back to the Bronze Age. The citadel sits on top of a rocky hill, making it an ideal defensive area. This was a bustling community even before the Romans showed up in the 3rd century BCE. Scholars think the fortress that we see today was built on top of a Punic-era acropolis, and over time morphed into a castle and refuge for Gozo's inhabitants. They needed a secure place. Gozo had been prime pickings for Ottomans looking for booty and slaves, and in 1551, or some 15 years after the Knights of St. John had arrived on the Big Island, the citadel actually fell to the Ottomans, led by, among others, Dragut, a notable Ottoman sailor and commander who was to play a very important role in the somewhat later siege of Malta in 1565. Gozo was still small potatoes, though. The Ottomans' initial plan was to take over in and around the Grand Harbor, but they were repelled by the Knights. Next, they scouted out Medina, but again, they gave up. Out of spite, I think, and looking to salvage something from the Sultan's investment, they besieged Gozo instead. Eventually, the citadel fell, and nearly the entire population was taken captive, including the knights garrisoning the island and the governor. Only a monk and 40 old Gozatans were spared. The image on the left is one of Dragut, although this statue isn't within 1,500 miles of Gozo. It's from the Topkapı Palace in Istanbul. Notice that in this memorial he's shown with his hand covering the world, which reminds us of his real brief from the Sultan, "Conquer the world for me." The winners of battles or sieges usually write most of the history, at least initially, and sometimes, by the time these interlopers are finally ousted, people have actually forgotten the name of their own heroes. Still, there are always heroes. There's a legend about one of the defenders of Gozo. His name was Bernardo Dupuo, a soldier who is said to have fought bravely in the defense. The city walls had been breached, most of his fellow soldiers were dead, he knew his wife and 2 daughters were about to be taken into slavery. He apparently killed them himself. The plaque on the right purports to be a memorial at his home. Was it really? Or was it something to appeal to the memory or to perhaps just tickle the fancy of visitors? I'll let you be the judge. St. George's Square is a lively area in the city of Rabat. This view from Google Earth shows you the square, the small area with the red awnings just in front of the basilica, from space. The facade of the Basilica of St. John overlooks the square, which features plenty of restaurants, bars, and cafes. The square also features plenty of balconies, including several of the enclosed green wooded painted affairs like I saw in Valletta. This area is quite attractive. Many of the open balconies featured flowers, but this one shows us a decorative plate illustrating St. George, complete with colored lights for nighttime viewing. I wish we had spent more time in the area. St. George was a Christian martyr and probably was a real person born in what is now Turkey. He was a soldier for the Roman Empire during Diocletian's time, and the victim of one of the emperor's persecutions. He's celebrated for his unwavering faith and courage. His cult dates back to Byzantine times and was introduced here probably around 2 centuries after Diocletian had his head removed for refusing to give up Christianity. George is the saint of this parish, and for centuries he was the primary saint of the Gozatans. No one came close to his popularity, although of course others were recognized and venerated. You probably know George's story. He's usually shown either on horseback or on foot with a raised sword, cowering, threatened beautiful maiden and a terrifying dragon lurking nearby. Sometimes he wears St. George's cross on his armor. In the stories, he kills the dragon, rescues the beautiful maiden, there's always a beautiful maiden in these stories, and becomes a symbol of triumph over evil. The Crusaders loved St. George, who was their heavenly battle bro. The faithful pray to him to this day for backup in battle. He protects knights, horses, and soldiers, and a little oddly, to my thinking, acts as a kind of divine dermatologist. That actually makes him the go-to guy for any skin diseases. When plague, which manifests initially as a kind of skin disease, swept through medieval Europe, people turned to George for help. One of the difficulties in photographing the facade of the basilica was that to get the entire shot, I had to stand at the bottom of a rather significant number of steps and back quite a bit in the square, so my camera was angled sharply upward. That meant I really didn't understand what sat behind the facade of the building. I did see that there are wings on each side of the facade, and I walked up to one of them on the right-hand side and saw a statue showing me Joseph with Jesus in one hand and a model of what was meant to be the church in the other. It took me until well after I came home from the trip and was staring at my photos to realize that this was a model of the basilica itself, at least an early version of it, and that the building had a dome. The city and the fortress were excellently marked and easy to navigate. I really could have managed this one on my own. St. George's, which is dedicated to St. George the Dragon Slayer, sits proudly overlooking the square by the same name. From the square, you see a lovely Baroque-style building put together mostly out of native limestone. The building went up between 1672 and 1678, with construction overseen by the Knights of St. John. The architect was a man named Vittorio Cassar, not the Cassar who was a member of the Knights and who oversaw the design and construction of so many Knights-era buildings in and around Valletta. Vittorio had the same name and the same occupation, but was from a different family. Cassar, incidentally, is the 10th most common multi-surname, and it means enduring, and his basilica certainly has been. Cassar ended up demolishing all of the existing buildings in front of the basilica to actually create the square. The building has 10 domes and 2 spires, which only became apparent to me when I looked at an aerial image courtesy of Google Earth. Notice those tiny black rectangles on some of the buildings? Those are solar panels. Around 1 in 4 houses here in the city have at least a solar hot water heater, and many have more. Visitors and congregants either climb up those steps or take the easy way and walk up a much kinder ramp and enter through the main entryway, which is decorated with these bronze doors. They might look old, but they're actually quite new. They only went into place in 2004. The doors were actually commissioned to commemorate the great jubilee of the year 2000, which marked the beginning of the 3rd millennium of Christianity. At the top are the words Porta Salutis, which means the door of heaven. The phrase comes from John, in which Jesus tells us that I am the door to salvation. Once inside, your eyes are confronted with an interior in which every visible square inch of wall space is decorated. Some of it is paintings, there are frescoes, stained glass, or fine and very expensive stone, chiefly marble, which must have been imported and had to have been expensive. The fresco at the apse of the building shows us St. George's entry into heaven. It's by an artist named Giambattista Contil. An image of a saint entering to heaven isn't really uncommon or a big deal, but this one is because it shows what appears to be an American Indian among the adoring throng on the right-hand side of the pane. Only later did I learn that Contil tended to tell stories of battles and triumphs. He was born in 1668, so he lived long enough to know at least a little bit about the New World. There are additional reminders of the patron of the city in the form of this gilt-edged fresco and a painting by one of the most famous of the Knights artists, Matteo Preti. The paintings and frescoes we looked at earlier are just a sample of the images here in the basilica. These two also celebrate St. George. On the left we see an interpretation of his martyrdom, and on the right is another interpretation of his ascent into heaven, this time without the Indians. Every real estate agent on the planet will tell you that the top 3 things to consider are location, location, location. Independence Square squats near the beginning of the entryway to the Citadel and is well-meaning but not particularly attractive in my opinion. This is where the local tour guides meet and drop off their customers, mostly because there's no other way in, and there's also a public restroom here. It's fly-ridden and somewhat smelly, but nevertheless was welcome, at least to me, because, in my opinion, beggars can't be choosers. For the hot, the tired, or the overheated, there are also a number of bars and cafes, some of them recommended by guides who apparently must be getting a kickback for their assistance. I visited just 2 years after the rehabilitation of the fortress was completed, so the barkeepers in the square were still doing quite well. My guess would be that if they had a say in the matter, and they might have, they protested some of the new accommodations included in the fortress. And if they did, they won. Inside, there is no bar or cafe. Still, I suspect in the time since I visited, the barkeepers and cafe owners have been encouraged to pull up their proverbial socks and clean the place up. Better bathrooms and an air-conditioned visitors center await inside the Citadel, and it's only a matter of time until some kind of cafe opens up. In the center of the square is a monument meant to be a symbol of Gozo's spirit of resilience. The inscription on the base tells us it's a monument to Gozotans who died during World War II. Refreshed and relaxed, it was time to gird ourselves to the walk uphill to the fortress. Tourists today inherit the fact that the fortress was sited up on a hill and have to climb a lot of steps, complete with handrails to help, or on a resurfaced but still steep and potentially slippery ramp to enter the citadel through St. Martin's demi-bastion. A lookout from the fortress shows us a view of part of the city with the red domed Basilica of St. George's in the background. Looking down, and in my case actually climbing back down those steps, gives you something really odd to look at as well. An obelisk, looking a little like something the Roman imperials might have swiped and brought here from Egypt. It wasn't. It's a much more recent addition. Between 1839 and 1843, the British built the Gozo Aqueduct to bring water here to the city. The obelisk was built to commemorate the opening of the aqueduct, but also commemorates the Siege of Malta and the Siege of Gozo in 1551. The inscription reads, "Remember the brave defenders of Gozo, who resisted the Ottoman invasion in 1551. Very little remains from the days of the Acropolis or the Bronze Age. These openings aren't meant to be potties for young boys, although I have no doubt that some enterprising 4-year-olds have tried it over the years. A well-garrisoned and provisioned citadel can hold out as long as the soldiers, men, ammunition, food, and water supplies do. These are Bronze Age silos, dating back at least 2,500 years, and probably were used to store food, or perhaps water or oil. Gozo Cathedral, also known as the Cathedral of the Assumption, sits inside the citadel. This building was designed in Baroque style by a Maltese architect named Lorenzo Gaffa. Gaffa also designed St. Paul's Cathedral, which we visited in Medina. Archaeologists think that this might have actually been the site of a much earlier Roman-era temple of Juno, which was in turn replaced by an early Christian church dating back to 1299. That building was damaged by the big earthquake we already talked about, which occurred in 1693. A few years later, a local nobleman arranged for the old building to be demolished to the ground and a new church built. Construction began in late 1697. Entering the church is a real challenge. It sits on top of a monumental set of steps, and although there is a handrail on one side, this thing was definitely not handicapped friendly. In the rehabilitation of the Citadel in 2016, a handicapped accessible ramp was added on the left. Most people seem to use that. The way the church is sited, uphill from the main square, means that just like at St. George's Basilica, you can't really tell what lies behind that facade. The cathedral is in the shape of a cross and has a raised area in the center which was clearly meant to be a dome, but there is no dome there. You can see it was built right next to the city walls and overlooking the defensive ditch, which is now planted with gardens in this Google Earth image. Walk around the back and along the city walls and you can see the bell tower as well as the extent of the false front of the facade. The interior shown here gives you some idea of the richness and beauty of the decorations, including those glass chandeliers over the alcoves on each side of the main aisle. The building has an aperture for a dome, but this is roofed over with a flat ceiling containing a trompe-l'oeil painting of a dome. Why no dome when there was obviously meant to be one? There are two theories, at least according to the Malta Independent newspaper. The first is that architect Gaffa, aware of what brought down the predecessor building, decided a dome here was literally too risky. He began work in 1697, just a few years after that big earthquake, which led to his having to rebuild the Medina Cathedral as well. Could it be that the church authorities in Gozo were somewhat apprehensive at building a church with a dome on such a high hill where wind, rain, and possibly unsteady ground could affect it? I think that's a real possibility. There is an alternate theory that there's no dome because the authorities ran out of money. Either way, to cover up the vast hole that stood instead of a dome, the authorities put in a roof and a trompe l'oeil painting to make you think you're looking up at a dome. I tried to photograph it, but my photograph was a bust. It was just too dark. And my search for a photo of it was actually a failure. But Joe Zamet Siantar wrote a book about it and included a photo on the cover of his book, shown here. There is more to see and do on Gozo than just Rabat and the Citadel, although sadly I didn't get the opportunity to do these things. Among the best-known other sites are probably the giant temples. Their name in Malta actually means place of the giants, and construction dates back to sometime in the Stone Age, making them older than the pyramids of Egypt. According to Gozotan folk tales, a giantess who lived on fava beans and honey, which are still produced here on the island, bore a child fathered by a mere mortal. She supposedly built the temples as places of worship. This megalithic monument includes 2 temples and an incomplete third section, of which only the facade was partially built before it was abandoned. More recently lost, although not abandoned, but because it collapsed, was a place called the Azure Window, a nearly 100-foot tall natural stone arch that stood just off the coastline. In March 2017, the Azure Window met its fate during a storm and gave way. Fortunately, we have plenty of photos to remind us of it, and even some video. The archway became the backdrop for the wedding in the Game of Thrones. While neither the temples nor the area around the lost archway is visible from the Citadella, St. John the Baptist Church is. My distant photo was taken on a cloudy day, and sadly we didn't get to visit it, but this is the biggest church here on the island. Turning away from the distant St. John's, I took a last look from the city walls at the rooftops of Rabat and some of the terraced landscaping surrounding the citadel itself. That little patch of green you see on the photo on the left is a park, one of the few bits of green to be seen even when I was there in early May. The situation isn't much better outside the city. This second photo shows you some terraced land, already bone dry. Despite that, Gozo is an agriculturally productive island. It doesn't seem to be as densely populated or settled, so land is available, often terraced like the hill you see on the right, and sticking to the kinds of products that can be produced with dryland farming. For example, goat cheese. Goats can live on a far less lavish diet than cattle. Honey, wine from grapes, irrigated vegetables produced, I think, mostly in greenhouses like these, which I spotted close to the St. John the Baptist Church, olives, which like dry land, and figs, along with rabbits. During the siege of Malta in World War II, Gozo was not a prime military target. I suspect the shallow harbor made it far less appealing, which is a good thing since it was poorly defended. Being less appealing did not mean that the island was not attacked. Most of the bombs dropped on Gozo fell in fields or sea, but a number of Gozotans did perish during World War II. You'll remember that memorial to them back in Independence Square. Like Malta, it suffered grievously from the blockade, which kept out food and fuel. King George VI of the United Kingdom awarded the George Cross for gallantry to what was labeled Fortress Malta, but Gozo was not specifically included in the award. I have no idea how that happened. Thank you for joining me on this visit to Gozo's Citadel. Come back for another adventure with me, the Armchair Traveler.